Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. All right, hey guys, let's learn. Let's watch a video. What was the Dutch plan to colonize South Australia? I don't know. Let's find out. Preemptive like, history with Hilbert, original link, top description.
Did you know that Australia very nearly could have spoken Dutch instead of English? This is because the Dutch were the first Europeans to sight Australia and did a lot of the initial mapping of the subcontinent in the 17th century, something that I talked about in this video about the Dutch and Australia. The first sighting came in 1606 with Willem Janszoon aboard the ship Duifken. This was a VOC ship, the Dutch East India Company ship sailing south from Batam in what is now Indonesia. However, following certain other missions to Australia by Dutch crews, the VOC decided not to found any colonies there, unlike the British, who of course would go on to found colonies.
Yeah, that's not that surprising. I mean, Australia is kind of out of the way, so it's not really close to any important trade routes. And you don't have a big population there that you can kind of tax or get goods from to make money on. So that's not that surprising to me.
So why not? It was first come, first served, according to the European mentality at the time. So why didn't the Dutch set up any colonies? That's something I talk about in my video, but the Dutch did consider it. And we know that based on certain correspondence between a certain man, Jean-Pierre Purry, and the VOC in Batavia, today's Jakarta. Purry, as you can tell from his name, was not a native Dutchman, but was born in what is today Switzerland and then was part of Prussia. He joined the VOC in 1713 and made the voyage from Europe over to the Dutch East.
Did you say parts of Switzerland were once part of Prussia? That's interesting. I heard that right. I wouldn't have expected that.
Indies, today Switzerland, and then was part of Prussia. He joined the VOC in 1713 and made the voyage from Europe over to the Dutch East Indies, where he settled in Batavia. It's not precisely clear what his role with the VOC was, except that he had joined in a military capacity as a soldier, although it seems that he was a deeply Christian man and may have been involved as some kind of chaplain or among the clergy of the troops. Settling in Batavia, he had various ideas about the Earth and how climate worked, and that particular zones of the Earth would be more favorable to human habitation than others. In particular, these climate zones also gave rise to different materials being available. This he sketched out in 1717 in his masterwork, the Mémoire sur les pays de Cafre et la terre de nuit. In this, he countered the arguments left behind by various Dutch captains that Australia was uninhabitable and said that there should be parts that would be very susceptible to human habitation, by that meaning European styles of farming. He presented these ideas to the Governor-General of the VOC, Christoffel von Swol, who was the man in charge and who he needed to persuade. His ideas were to set up a colony in the Eyre Peninsula, a peninsula in the very south of the Australian landmass that he felt would be suitable for a number of reasons.
Near, like, modern-day Adelaide, I think?
First of all, there was a good harbour to be had there. It was low in the water and would shield ships and make a suitable place of entry for Dutch VOC vessels that were passing by and supplying the colony. Secondly, based on his climatological models, he believed that there should be abundant gold and silver there, which the Dutch could exploit and trade, which of course was the main aim of the VOC. He based this on the idea that it was at a similar latitude to the gold and silver mines controlled by the Spanish in Chile, Peru, and Mexico. These, of course, having made the Spanish incredibly wealthy.
Okay, so I was a little confused why, because it seemed pretty obvious, you know, some areas of the world are less habitable to humans. I mean, that doesn't take a genius to find out. I'm sure that was obvious, but it seems like he might have an argument that places of similar latitude or environment to other places in the world might harbor the same minerals, which It's interesting if I'm getting that right.
Following their conquest of Peru, and which the Dutch, in their earlier war against the Spanish, had also profited from with their privateering actions. Now they wanted to go straight to the source and get their own gold and silver mines. Of course, we know today that this doesn't make sense at all. The latitude doesn't affect where gold and silver is found. But in the 17th century and the 18th century, you could get away with these kinds of theories.
But did he have any other examples? Like, did he see, like, hey, these two areas are on the same latitude or around the same latitude, and they both had the same precious metals or goods or availability of crop land? Or was it just a whim that, hey, this place has gold, this is the same latitude, so they must have gold? Because the latter seems much less scientific.
It wasn't just gold and silver that he thought would be good. The terrain itself, he guessed, was a latitude most fit for vines and other excellent fruits and plants, whereby the company would be enabled to supply their East India settlements with wines, fruits, oil, and corn. Importantly, of course, is that you can't really grow wine in the Indies, and so when the Dutch wanted wine for with their table, they would have to import it, often coming all the way from Europe, which was a long way and so very expensive. Purry was also quite optimistic about dealing with the local population, unlike many of the Dutch captains who'd written home believing them to be evil-natured and hostile. He said,
so is around the equator just not a good place for growing wine?
There is,
seeing how he sees modern-day Indonesia is not suitable
written
for
home believing them to be evil-natured and hostile. He said, there is reason to believe the establishing a good colony of Europeans would be so far from being any detriment to the inhabitants of the land of knights, that is, the land of Nouts, and from driving them out of their possessions, that on the contrary, it would procure them all sorts of advantages, as well as from a civilized life, as from the arts and sciences.
White savior
it would bring
complex.
among them, provided this was done with mildness, and we look upon them as poor creatures who, though stupid and ignorant, don't cease as well as we to be members of human society. Certainly wouldn't pass muster today, but it's better than some other 17th century accounts.
Yeah, it's interesting how in a time where there was, full-on 1700s, was full-on Atlantic slave trade, and I'm sure other slave trades around the world, that there was obviously this moral conundrum that they did see, and that you can see here. Like, I'm almost surprised that people would even need at the time to rationalize exploiting some what they called like subhuman compared to them, but clearly they're providing arguments for them, which is interesting in its own right, that they clearly saw them as superior to them, but they still had to kind of do some mental gymnastics is interesting.
This was the idea of lifting up native peoples to European standards, which was undoubtedly something that he would have attempted with his missionary background had he been able to create this colony in the first place. He also argued that he would be able to bring over many of his fellow Swiss to join in this colony, something that wasn't unknown given that the VOC regularly employed foreigners in its colonies and its vessels. The VOC weighed up the options and said no. We know from a letter sent by the VOC regarding this matter that we do not agree with the scheme of this man. There is no prospect of use or benefit to the company in it, but rather very certain and heavy costs.
Right, but given the first come, first serve kind of thing, like that it seems Europeans agreed on, wouldn't it be worth at least putting some small outposts in Australia just for later bargaining rights? You don't have to put any huge effort into it, but just be like, hey, we found this, we have a colony here, this is our land, and then just kind of keep it there as some asset in the future, not like you have to do huge investments.
Why did the VOC decide not to colonize Australia when this plan had been laid out before?
So I'm imagining it's because they had other more important and fruitful money-making opportunities that they would be more worthy of investment, and because it wasn't that crucial for even outposts for trading or outposts for staying on your way to trade with someone else. That's where my mind goes. Let's see if that's
Part
the case.
of it may lie in the character of the VOC's Governor General. Christoffel van Swol was a famously difficult individual who was very reluctant to try out new ideas. For example, he was against the importation of coffee beans into Java, which eventually would become incredibly lucrative for the Dutch East Indies after the price of spices had fallen through the floor in the 18th century. He also believed that the VOC was already overstretched as it was, and was against further expansion in the Dutch East Indies, let alone creating new colonies that would need to be supplied. Of course, it's important to remember that the Dutch East India Company by the early 18th century was past its prime. The 17th century had been the Dutch Golden Age, but following that period it was really being eclipsed on the world stage. It had a small population, and that didn't help with founding new colonies. For example, the British were rising higher and higher during this century, with their own British East India Company expanding its trade and creating more powerful colonies around the world. In hindsight, this was probably the correct decision by the VOC, because we now know that there is no gold and silver to be found in the Eyre Peninsula. Even though there are some other rare metals, it's doubted that the Dutch would have been able to extract and use these. However, Purry was right on one point, and that was the fact that it's excellent wine growing land. And we all know today that Australian wine is world famous, so at least he got that right. Purry himself in 1726 would have another stab at creating a colony. He left the Dutch East Indies and
By the way, I am a little surprised that the early 18th century, early 1700s, the Dutch were past their prime. I thought that would have still been like the golden age of Dutch trade and whatnot. But saying past your prime isn't saying that you're relegated to the background, obviously.
For the Carolinas, at that point creating a colony. He left the Dutch East Indies and sailed for the Carolinas, at that point part of the 13 colonies controlled by the British. He was granted permission to start his own colony in South Carolina, and it's named after him and still exists to this day. It's called Purrysburg. He set up a colony of several hundred French and German-speaking Swiss in the Carolinas, but eventually this failed when most of them moved out into the surrounding area. However, Purry still has many descendants that live in the area today who have the surname de Purry, or probably pronounced de Purry or something similar. So I guess he got his wish in the end. But for the VOC, they were not interested in creating a colony in Australia. New Holland, the name given to the landmass after all, became Australia. And this was as a result that the British did go ahead and create that colony. But sometimes it's interesting to think about the hypothetical. What might have happened if the Dutch had set up a colony there? In all likelihood, it probably would have failed. It was a very difficult place to set up, and the Dutch East India Company in the early 18th century didn't have the same resources that it had at the height of its power, and that the British would later bring to bear in the region. Anyway, let me know in the comments below. Did you know that there was a Dutch plan to set up a colony, or rather a Swiss plan, I suppose, a VOC plan? And do you think that it would have been successful? Might we have seen some kind of Australian boeren, Afrikaners, had this happened today if the British had come in later on, as they did with many Dutch colonies around the world? Who knows? We simply do not.
Interesting. So maybe they're like a similar to South Afrikaans Boer population. A similar thing could have been in Australia, but of course, the southern tip of Africa is much more along high trafficking lanes, especially before the Suez Canal, obviously, which this was. And so, yeah, maybe if they put more attention into it, then sure, I can see that as a possibility. But what would have given them that incentive? I don't see what would have done it. And it seems like in the 1600s, 15s, and then the 1600s, with the Spanish and Portuguese still being high on their game and really focusing on the New World, I guess Australia could be like the new world, but focusing on North and South America. And then you had the Dutch, who were also seafaring early on and had the political will to send out ships to go set up colonies and explore, that they were a victim of their low population. I guess that really, when powers like France and the UK came along, it's like, all right, yeah, thanks for finding this. We're going to take this over now, though. So, yeah, very interesting. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any comments down below. Did I say anything you disagree with or was wrong? Let me know. Answering any of my questions. You guys are always great with that. And I hope I'll see you guys next video. We'll keep on learning, hopefully. Bye, guys.